Hello, and welcome back to our study on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. These series of video studies that are uploaded to YouTube, are studies of my book that I wrote on the 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. The book name is Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation. And this book can be purchased at Amazon.com. You just go to Amazon.com, put in my name, Ross Bond. That's spelled R-O-S-S. The last name is spelled Bond, B-A-G-N-E. These series of studies actually began at St. Paul's Lutheran Church way back in October of 2010. And each of these studies lasted 2 hours. But because of the limits of the internet and my bandwidth and so forth, each of these studies where I'm doing on the internet will last 30 minutes because that's actually about the limit I can upload with the bandwidth I had and the speed of the YouTube server. So each study is about 30 minutes long. In the first 3 studies, we got into the introduction, and now we're going to get into the first chapter of the book. The first chapter of the book is called The Garden, and this is actually a short story that I wrote, I think, back in the 80s or something like that. And I wanted to put this in the book because it actually sets the mood, in my opinion, of the book, to emphasize the pathos of existing and finding truth, because for SK, truth was really a problem of pathos and dialectics, equally accessible to all people through pathos. And I wanted to set the mood to show a character, and the name of my character is Joseph Skor, and his pathological struggle to attain what SK came later to call religiousness A. And we'll get into religiousness A, religiousness B a lot later in the book. But this is a description, to put it in pathological existential terms, of this transition, in this case from the aesthetic to religiousness A. This is not the ultimate leap of faith from religiousness A and the ethical life to the specifically Christian life, but it is the leap of faith, if you want to call it that, in a diminished way, from the aesthetic existence to religiousness A, the deist religion, the one universal religion throughout the entire world. Now, the book was based on an experience I had with a Muslim roommate of mine way back in the 70s when I went to George Washington University. His name was Farouk. And this interaction that we had in my first experience with the Muslim culture, we never got into deep theological disputes at all. I mean, that was, but I do get into them in this book in order to represent the conflict, the age-old conflict going back to the 8th century between the Muslim religion and Christianity. So I use this as an occasion, a poetic occasion, to write the book. I have to say something to flatter myself, and that is that I meant to write this book as a microcosm of the world, with this conflict between Muslims and Christians included. And this was written before the radical Muslim attacks upon Christendom, or the Western world. So it really is not influenced by modern day events that we've seen in the last 10 years, but rather something that goes all the way back to the 1980s. So it's a microcosm to emphasize the pathos of existence, to represent a small world, a microcosm of a world, and the pathos of someone who goes through this experience. And I wanted to say too that the Farouk in the novel is not the same as my roommate, in case he's out there somewhere and realizes that I wrote a book that was partly or largely, well, partly I would say, um, inspired by this experience that I had. The first time I had ever had an experience with Muslim culture and their ways. But as I said, we were not at odds in a religious sense, because at that time I wasn't even a Christian anyway, so I had no reason to dispute the Muslim religion. But we never got into that. And I do use the name Farouk for my antagonist in the book, but it's not the same Farouk. The real Farouk in this novel is the lawyer you'll come across if you ever read the short story. And the short story is largely based on the great inspiration that a short story writer, the great French writer Guy de Maupassant, and I kind of pattern it after his style, and hopefully it's a good short story and you'll be interested in reading it. But really, it's not really necessary to an understanding of the book. You can skip over that without any real damage and just go on to the next chapter. The next chapter begins with a description of the genesis of S.K.'s thought. It's really largely a biography, a biographical description of S.K.'s own experiences in becoming an author and why he chose to write the way he did and write about the topics that he did and so forth. Because to a large extent, to understand S.K., you have to understand his life, because he was an existential writer who wrote about his own personal experiences and eschewed the subjective speculation about things and became a speculative, and eschewed speculative thinking and became a subjective thinker. So to understand S.K. in a large part, you really do need to understand his life. So I try to bring in as much of his own personal experiences as possible to understand S.K. It was sometime between the ages of 25 to 28, I put it at 25, when S.K. decided to become an author. He had been going to school for about 10 years in Germany and in Copenhagen, and he decided that he wanted to be an author. But at the same time he decided this, he experienced an event that led him in two different directions at the same time. And it was important for S.K. to describe this dichotomy in his writings, his aesthetic and philosophical writings, and then his religious writings. Because to S.K., his religious writings were far more important than his aesthetic and philosophical writings. So he wanted to describe that for history and make it known that he was not just an aesthetic and philosophical writer, but also a religious writer in his discourses. In his 21st year, he experienced his first religious conversion. And I quote this from Walter Lowry's book on S.K. in Volume 1, page 170. And he quotes a passage in his journals which indicates this. Before my real activity as an author began, there was an occurrence, or rather a factum, to use a word which etymologically implies that I had an active role to play, since presumably an occurrence would not have been sufficient, for I had to be the active agent in the affair. I cannot elucidate this factum more particularly, telling in what it consisted, how terribly dialectical it was, and so forth and so on, etc., etc. Now, this is typical S.K., trying to describe something indirectly without directly describing it. And it was certainly a religious experience, which he wanted to downplay, like many other theologians, going back to St. Paul, for example, who was embarrassed, in a sense, to describe his religious experiences because he didn't want to draw attention to them. Pascal was the same way, and Luther was the same way. He eschewed the emphasis on mysticism in Christianity, and yet there is a mystical aspect to Christianity, but it can be so easily abused if you're not careful. So just like with SK, or just like with Pascal, Luther, St. Paul, he wanted to downplay that particular aspect of it. And so he goes on for a long time, and I like to put these passages in depth to give you some idea of his thinking, but of course we don't have time to go into this long narrative about the beginning of his authorship. But I go back to his journals and his point of view for my work as an author to understand what this factum exactly was and why he had a dichotomy in his life between aesthetic, philosophical, and religious. And there is a quotation, I think, that explains this experience very well. And in his journals, he says, "There is an indescribable joy which glows through us as unaccountably as the apostle's outburst is unexpected. Rejoice, and again I say rejoice. Not joy over this or that, but full jubilation, with hearts and souls and voices. I rejoice over my joy of, in, by, at, on, through, with my joy. A heavenly refrain, which cuts short, as it were, our ordinary song, a joy which cools and refreshes like a breeze, a gust of the trade wind which blows from the grove of Mamre." The grove of Mamre refers to Genesis 18:1, in which the three strangers meet Abraham in this grove. And it leads to what he calls the eternal mansions. So this is quite obviously a religious experience. And SK throughout his authorship always referred to this as an awakening, but not the religious conversion which comes later on in the leap of faith. Now, this for SK was a big part of the ethical life, but it doesn't mark the beginning of the ethical life. The ethical life in the individual is a desire or a wish to transform oneself into something better. And it happens, I think, to almost all of us in our 20s, sometimes 30s, sometimes it never happens. Sometimes people never grow up and decide they want to become more, they want to reject this life of what SK called perdition. And SK at the time, I wouldn't call him an alcoholic, but he did have bouts of drinking with his friends, and we'll get into that in Stages on Life's Way in Vino Veritas, which was quite obviously, to a large extent, autobiographical. Drinking, a life of what you might call debauchery, a life of indolence and laziness. And he decided about this time that when he wanted to become an author, to also transform his life, to reform his life and become an ethical person. And this is really the desire in the person to enter into the ethical sphere of existence. And I point to an experience he had with his beloved professor, Paul Moeller. Paul Moeller was a professor who SK admired the most of any of his professors. In fact, he dedicated a book, Concept of Dread, which we're going to get into, to Paul Moeller. And it was Paul Moeller who rebuked SK for his immense hubris and conceit and all the intellectual gifts that he had been given. And SK, with this rebuke, came to realize that he was really puffed up, that he was really conceited, and needed to reform his life and get away from the life of perdition, the life of drinking, and a couple of problems he had sexually, or one or two, um, which we will discuss later in a relationship he probably had with a prostitute and so forth. And but those things are speculative as to what exactly the life of perdition was that S.K. was leading, and many biographers have different sorts of understandings of this, what he considered this life of perdition. He wasn't committing adultery, he didn't murder anybody, but he did have his excesses and in his indolence, and he realized that. The rebuke by Paul Moeller was this, or at least the rebuke that led to his desire to reform his life was this experience. I have just come from a party of which I was the soul. Witticisms flowed from my mouth. All laughed and admired me. But I went away and wanted to shoot myself. So here you see that S.K. came to realize the hubris, the conceit that he had developed with all the wonderful, beautiful, expressive talents that he had as a thinker and a writer. And in my opinion, it was this rebuke by Paul Moeller of S.K. It probably happened at the party that day, although that's not clear. The rebuke was this: you are so thoroughly and thoroughly polemicalized that it is perfectly frightful. And this kind of, it kind of had a big influence on S.K. because he admired Paul Moeller so much and wanted Paul Moeller, as we all do, the people we respect, he wanted Paul Moeller's respect of him. So it was this inspiration then that made S.K. want to go on to reform his life and sober up, find something to do with his life. But a big part of this diversion in his life, the desire to become an author, and then the desire to reform himself ethically and religiously, gave S.K. a fork in the road, so to speak. He had this desire to write aesthetically and philosophically, and yet at the same time, he had this religious inclination now that he wanted to pursue. So he had two forms of writing. He had two different sorts of works throughout his aesthetic and philosophical and his religious writings. Now, his religious writings were the most important to S.K., and he always assigned his own names to his religious writings because those were the works that he wanted to be most well known or recognized for, and not so much his aesthetic and philosophical writings, but because he had this enormous aesthetic and philosophical predisposition, he felt a need to work these things through to get to what was really important to him, and that was the religious. So he was an aesthetic and philosophical writer, and at the same time a religious writer, and wrote in both spheres of existence. So at this time, with his religious conversion, the inspiration came to him to analyze the relationship between the aesthetic philosophical concepts of life and the religious. In addition, during his long years of study at the universities he had attended, he came to the conclusion that there was a totally profound and complete misunderstanding at the time of the relationship between philosophy and religion. And of course, that did become a major problem in the 19th century, especially with thinkers like Hegel, Fichte, Marx, and many other philosophers who had a so-called higher criticism of Christianity. And it also was a big part of the problem in the 20th century with authors like Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Jaspers. So he saw this as a major problem in trying to reconcile aesthetics and philosophic ideas with religious ideas. So this was the inspiration for his authorship. And he writes in his book by Johannes Climacus, the pseudonym, about the beginning of his authorship. So I resolved to begin, and my first act, in order to begin from the beginning, would be to exhibit the existential relationship between the aesthetic and the ethical within an existing individual. The task was thus set, and I foresaw that the labor would be voluminous enough, especially that I would have to be prepared sometimes to remain inactive when the spirit refused to support me with an access of pathos. So, authors would call that writer's block. And all of us authors have that period of time. S.K. rarely had that. Actually, he was enormously prolific, and like I think probably an author like Shakespeare, he did not have a great problem with writer's block. But there were times when he did need to think things through. He did need to understand existence in a deeper form and allow his thoughts to mature. And we see that in the evolution of his writings, like De Omnibus Dubitandum Est, and then or concept of irony. And we see the development, because he knew that he had taken a very major task, a very major problem to analyze in his incredibly dialectical mind. And I think he did it better than anyone. I mean, I've been reading Pascal lately, and Thomas Aquinas. These were theologians, philosophers, who tried to do the same thing. But in my opinion, no one has ever done it as well as S.K., and maybe never will. I mean, I think he is the authority on this issue of this complex relationship between reason and faith. And that's what the whole book is about. And we'll get into all of that as we go along. So he gives this very long analysis of how he began, and a lot of it's very humorous, and he likes to poke fun at himself in the pseudonym of Johannes Climacus. And he says in the book, I had been a student for 60 years. Although never lazy, all my activity nevertheless was like glittering inactivity, a kind of occupation for which I still have a great partiality, and for which perhaps I have a little genius. I read much, spent the remainder of the day idling and thinking, or thinking and idling, but that was all it came to. The earliest sproutings of my productivity barely sufficed for my daily use, and were consumed in their first greening. And here he's referring to his very earliest works until he had matured as a thinker. An inexplicable persuasive power constantly held me back, my strength as well as my artifice. The power was my indolence. It is not like the impetuous inspiration of love, not like the strong prompting of enthusiasm. It was rather like a housekeeper who holds one back, with whom one is very well off, so well off it never occurs to one to get married. So here's an ironic, humorous description of his own kind of hesitancy and, in some ways, laziness in getting this whole project going. And he goes on for a long, long time. I'll put this up here. You can see from this on this page and all the way through this page. And finally, in this soliloquy where he's talking to himself, he says, well, here my soliloquy was interrupted, for my cigar was smoked out, almost smoked out, and a new one had to be lit. So I smoked again, and then suddenly this thought flashed through my mind. You must do something, but inasmuch as with my limited capacities, it will be impossible to make everything easier, than it has become, you must, with the same humanitarian enthusiasm as the others, undertake to make something harder. This notion pleased me immensely, and at the same time, it flattered me to think that I, like the rest of them, would be loved and esteemed by the whole community. And here we have again a humorous poking fun at himself and how the story of the beginning of his authorship began. And it pokes fun too indirectly at Hegel in the beginning of Hegel's philosophy, which was to begin with nothing. And SK had a lot of fun with this idea, because if you begin with nothing, you have nothing to begin with and you can't begin. But all major philosophers of the 19th century adopted the Descartes concept of doubting everything, the omnibus dubitandum est. And everyone of major significance followed this path in the 19th century. And SK goes into an enormous amount of analysis in the omnibus dubitandum est, which I don't know if it's published today. I don't know if you can get a copy, but it gives you a real interesting foundation of what his analysis became later, because he goes into an incredible analysis, dialectical analysis of the Descartes concept of the omnibus dubitandum est. And he first thought that Descartes, who many philosophers say was the father of modern philosophy, it gives you good insight into how he began his authorship by thinking that Descartes was the person he had to answer and not Hegel. Later he came to the realization that it wasn't Descartes, but it was Georg Hegel. So he goes on for a long time, and we're not going to have the time to go through the whole thing, but it is a wonderful passage on the pathos of existing and how philosophy begins with really not doubt, because if you doubt everything, you can't begin, but rather with curiosity, with wonder. And that's how Greek philosophers started their philosophy, not with doubting everything. They had to find something to start with, and this is SK's answer to Hegel and all the philosophers who wanted to start with nothing. And I think it's wonderfully humorous when you look at it in terms of the modern philosophy of the 19th century, which isn't so modern anymore, but it was modern philosophy at the time of the 19th century. So with all of these ideas, SK began his authorship as a subjective thinker. The full scope of what his authorship was to become was beyond SK's knowledge at the time, and is why, in the point of view, he pointed out that to make a more precise reckoning of the share that God had for him, because he really felt that God was behind this project of his, he wanted to point out, in the point of view from my work as an author, that he didn't really know the scope and the nature of his thinking and where it would lead him, but he felt that God was behind him. So he felt, to be honest, he could not say with authority that he knew what the end was from the beginning. And another Hegelian idea we'll get into, and that God would really lead him in this project. And that's why I think, personally, that Kierkegaard is someone who God took under his wing and led him to this authorship. And that's why he's such a prophet of the 20th century and so influential to both theology and philosophy. So he began his authorship himself, and he did not know where the authorship would ultimately go. But it was a premonition that God was behind the project and was inspiring his writings. And he says a lot about how God inspired all of his writings from beginning to end. So we're almost out of time. We've got through about half of this chapter, and hopefully I'll get the next chapter or the next study up on YouTube tomorrow, and we'll get into his idea of indirect communication. So I thank everybody for attending, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. I'm going to try to get the next tape done sometime tonight and upload.